Hello, good morning to those tuning in from the US, and good evening to everyone joining us from India. I'm Swarnali Singha, co founder and Chief Business Officer at Zeron, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this fireside chat. Vendor ecosystems are expanding faster than the visibility leaders have into them. And the risks hidden within these relationships now shape business impact more than ever. Today, we are exploring how quantified insight brings clarity, precision, and stronger decision making to third party exposure. I'm joined by Alex Lam, our executive advisor at Zeron, a seasoned strategy and merger acquisition leader with deep experience across enterprise IT, cloud, and cybersecurity. Alex, great to have you with us.
Thank you, Swarnali. It's a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
Now, with this exciting topic and with that context, we will just get started. With the question that for someone new to the topic, how do you define vendor risk in 2025? And why does it matter so much more now than ever it has been?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think to start, just from a definition perspective, right? We define a third party as any external member to the organization that's, for example, providing goods and services to the organization. So this could take the form of a contractor, a supplier, IT provider, software vendor, etc. And any third party relationship there that potentially could have a risk on a negative impact on the organization. And this risk can take the shape of many forms. For example, it could be a reputational risk, it could be an operational risk, financial risk, compliance and regulatory risk, and probably the latter, which is cybersecurity related, which is probably a topic that a lot of us here on the call are interested in, is that could have an impact on the organization. Now, the reality is everything is sort of interrelated these days. As you know, these prevalent cybersecurity breaches and various hiccups that have happened over the world have impact on organizations' reputation. It can affect how customers see them, and they can have a loss of business and so forth. And so the reason why this matters more today than perhaps before is that we've gone through this massive digital transformation in the past few years, especially if you compare the world today versus something post-pandemic versus before. So in order to enable these large swaths of SaaS and cloud solutions that underpin most of our businesses today, as well as to enable remote workforce solutions, having a global workforce that's able to digitally communicate with each other, the world has built up essentially requirements of an environment that needs to be multi-device, needs to be multi-tenant, and it needs to be plugged into various vibrant third-party ecosystems of data sources and credentials in order to support these digital workflows. And so as a result, what we see is with customers is that they've built up this massive web of third-party connectivity around their core applications through the use of APIs and data connectors. And so while this real-time connectivity is very powerful, and it enables these customers to do great things that they can do today that years prior they weren't able to in a digital world versus analog. Any hiccup in that third-party ecosystem has the potential to disrupt an entire line of business for the customer. And so I'll just conclude with a couple data points, right? So Gartner, I think back in early 2024, they did one of their enterprise surveys, and they conservatively show that nearly 50% or half of their enterprises surveyed had experienced some form of downtime due to a third-party cybersecurity risk. An even more prominent example would be also back in 2024 is the famous sort of CrowdStrike Falcon sensor update crash, right? Now, ironically, this wasn't a breach in a traditional sense, but this was a sort of a faulty update that was pushed out by CrowdStrike to their Falcon software platform that essentially had a hiccup where it could take down the Windows PC and Windows Server environments either through crashes or the classic blue screen of death, right? And so this was enough to take down several large enterprise customers, airlines, retail, e-commerce, healthcare systems, the like. I think I think total is probably over 8.5 million systems that went down because of something innocuous like a software update, right, on a third-party application. So, yeah, I think this is a very interesting topic. Definitely, this is a topic that's should be top of mind for most people in this day and age.
I think you are absolutely right, Alex, because with the growing rate that the vendors are growing, right? So it is
Mhm.
increasing the attack surface more for the organizations. Right now, based on the stats, like it provides that 60% of the breaches, it happens because of the vendors, right? So
Mhm.
that is a
Yep.
very important angle that we should look into. Now, coming to that part, like looking into the
Mhm.
vendor risk, who do you think should look into the vendor risk in an organization?
Yeah, I think it's I would maybe bucket into like four main groups. Obviously the top in mind and top in center is probably someone at the role of a CISO or his or her security team, right? Uh, Vendor risk obviously is a big part of their job in providing the overall risk posture and management for the organization. So the second group would be risk and compliance teams. They obviously need to ensure regulatory compliance, and then there needs to be a structured third-party management program that can be tracked and managed from their perspective. And so having some transparency and synchronization with the other relevant teams like internal audit, legal teams on an overall compliance program accountability is kind of key as they think of third-party risk. Uh, the third group is probably folks in procurement. For a lot of these large organizations, as you know, the whole vendor management ecosystem is a platform in itself, right? They have these large VMS platforms and everything. And for them, they need to ensure there's a proper management of existing vendors, as well as rigorous methodologies that they can use to assess onboarding of new vendors, right? So it's that kind of closed loop 360 system. And then the fourth group is probably a group that maybe people don't think of as much, but it's really the ultimately the business unit stakeholders, whether the general manager, the BU, or sort of the folks that are in the revenue generating side of the business, right? They ultimately, when we talk about some of these risks, will feel the brunt of it. And if you look at a lot of large organizations where some of the IT functions and security functions are sort of a shared resources and they're funded from the BUs on an annual basis, having greater awareness and understanding how some of these cybersecurity and vendor risks can impact their business obviously will make the job easier in securing funding, and they can see better ROI for their dollars invested. So yeah, I think definitely. I mean, it's a topic that should affect everyone in the organization, but I think definitely amongst those four groups, those are four key stakeholders I see.
I think this would be like one of the important takeaways for our audience here. Because like with every domains or departments within an organization, vendor is something that is always there, right? And everyone should be aware of the vendor risk that they are dealing with. And it should be like a framework which needs to be adapted as per the organization dynamics. Now, coming to this point, that why are vendor-related risks and the breaches are rising so much than the internal breaches? What do you think are the CISOs missing right now?
Yeah, I think kind of building upon what we've been talking about. I think an organization today easily could have hundreds of API links, data connectors, login entry points into their enterprise applications. So attackers are oftentimes targeting what they view as the weakest link from one of these kind of third-party connections as the sort of the tip of the spear entry point into the organization. Um, you know, Maybe a related example is you had the Snowflake data breach last year, and this is a situation where attackers had acquired or harvested a bunch of stolen Snowflake user credentials off of the dark web or whatever, and then they were able to go back and target specific Snowflake customers where they were aware that they weren't using a multi-factor authentication or MFA as part of the login process. And so they were very quickly with these stolen IDs able to, log in and penetrate these major Snowflake enterprise customer environments. And in the end, I think, around 165 major enterprise customer environments were breached and infiltrated. And once they were in, these attackers were able, through scripts and everything, easily kind of harvest PII data, customer data, whatever, right? And you had some pretty large customers that were then exposed to this data breach, and in the form of either being targeted for ransomware or the data itself was sold on the web. And so you had AT&T with, I think, call logs over 100 million customers, which they supposedly paid an undisclosed fee to claw it back. You had Ticketmaster, a large ticket agency here in the States. They had over 550 million or 560 million customer details that were stolen, and that actually led to massive disruption in their ticket sales operations, because these hackers were using the stolen information to spoof spam tickets, right? Create fake tickets and so forth. And that just breaks the whole system. You had LendingTree, a large, financial lending entity here in the States, 190 million users where the financial data was being sold and trying to auction online. You had Santander Bank, obviously a large European bank, also with exposure too. And so, the ramifications are huge, right? It once again, it's, and Snowflake's a large major vendor, but you could have these smaller vendor relationships that a lot of these CISOs have in their environment, and just that type of infiltration could unfortunately expose a lot of things that you weren't aware of, right? And so what CISOs and their cybersecurity teams probably are missing today is, I think there's still a high dependence on these point in time assessments, right? And there's, don't get me wrong, I mean, everyone needs to do their vendor assessments, and you need to have that baseline established. But when it's a sort of a static, periodic thing, there's always gaps in the periods, and that's where changes in vulnerability could happen. And then I think by the time you realize it, there's sort of this lag effect. And so being able to in real time understand how your risk posture is changing, good or bad, I think that's something that CISOs need to be more aware of, and build those methodologies into how they manage their environment.
I think it is true because, like right now, everything is dynamic in nature, right? Even the
Mm-hmm.
attack surface, like it is dynamic in nature. So, like, it is really hard to track, like what is being exposed on a real time basis.
Yep.
So, I think you already touched that point about the traditional assessments, but like if you can share more light on that, like why do traditional assessments fail to show the real exposure?
Yeah, I would say a few things, right? I mean, as I mentioned, there's a heavy emphasis on control checklists, which once again, it's any checklist is good, right? That gives you a starting point, but that prevents you from having visibility to the real time behavior and activity at the vendor level, right? So it's a point in time snapshot, but it's not a continuous management or understanding of your vendors. Second piece is a lot of the vendor assessments obviously require the vendors to report through their own attestment. And some of those reports obviously could be optimistic from the vendor side. There could be incomplete information provided. So what's the challenge for the security teams is they're oftentimes working with imperfect data, right? I mean, we'll never live in a world where there's standardized data from everyone, but oftentimes with that imperfect data, they're having to reconstruct the reality from something that's less ideal, right? The third bucket is probably, if you look at situation, is because of this lack of consistent data, it's really difficult to quantitatively compare different vendor risk across your vendor ecosystem consistently, right? It's still very kind of qualitative driven. And so once again, in an ideal world, we'd have more quantitative benchmarks and clear data that to show, hey, vendor A is here, vendor B is maybe here, but they've moved up to here. Today, it is a bit of art and science there. And then the kind of the fourth thing is, vendor assessments, because they're done on a periodic basis and lack that real update, there's always this gap in reporting back from the vendor once they've identified the issue to the customer, right? Now, in an ideal world, this should be more instantaneous, but we do live in a world today where that reporting is very manual. And so, very prominent example, anecdote is, just happened a few weeks ago is the Mixpanel OpenAI incident, right? Where you had Mixpanel, which is a third-party data analytics application provider to OpenAI, especially for their API developer users. Mixpanel was attacked. An attacker gained some unauthorized access to the Mixpanel platform, and they were able to export certain user information of OpenAPI users, right? Name, email ID, user ID, location stuff. Now, while the core OpenAI systems were not penetrated, this is obviously an embarrassing situation for all parties involved. Now, complicating the fact was this vulnerability was discovered by Mixpanel, I think back on like November 9th. And then they finally reported it to OpenAI on November, I think, 25th, which is more than 2 weeks later. So, we don't know the reasons why for the delay, but the reality is there was more than a 2-week delay, right? And so that in itself is that time gap that is very impactful for CISOs and something they should be aware of. How do you kind of require less dependency on your vendors to tell you something's wrong, and have systems in place that you could detect that sooner.
Absolutely, Alex. I think that is the dependency that, like with every day, that the organizations or the industry is creating as well. That is how interconnected we are. So now saying that, I think we will just quickly take up the questions that we are getting from the audience.
Sure.
If we can have it on the screen. Okay, here is one. As vendor ecosystem expand, what do you see as the biggest misconception organizations still have about third-party risk? Alex, do you want to take that up?
Yeah, I think I think it's once again getting back to the traditional view is, well, if my vendor ecosystem went from size A to size B, is just that, we need to have more resources thrown at the problem, and it's a very linear approach that scales. What I think is needed is more of this understanding of how the web is put together, right? So it's more of a topology view of your architecture to understand that these new vendors you're onboarding are interacting with your existing vendors this way, or interacting with your core systems this way, to have that context of what exactly what exactly is going on in your environment, and ultimately what the underlying risk is, versus just scaling from, okay, well, we had 50 vendors today, now we're managing 100, and we need to scale organization linearly, right? I think it's having that context and prioritization that will help improve things, I think.
Absolutely. And also, I would want to add a few points as well that I have observed that when the vendor risk assessments are happening, like most of them are really dependent on the questionnaire based, right? So when we share the questionnaire with the vendor and they answer it with all the possible good answers, right? Like they have all the controls in place, they have the certification in place. And when we are onboarding any vendor, like which is really a big name, that is the misconception that I believe that normally everyone has. Any vendor, like they can be breached, right? And if they get breached, then your policies or your controls or your reputation is in stake as well, right? So certifications, like the vendors can have ISO certifications or any other certification, but it is really important to check whether they have the controls implemented. What is the practice, cyber practice that they are also having? So I think these are also few of the misconceptions that the industry still like they face it.
Yep. 100%
Now
agree.
with that, correct. Now with that, like I would want to ask that the boards and regulators now expect CISOs to show measurable vendor risk. How does quantifying exposure change the way the leaders make decisions, you think?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I think if you first start with the boards themselves, they have obviously a fiduciary responsibility for the company on many things, and one of them is around corporate risk. And I think we've shown through some of the examples today in our discussion that definitely these cybersecurity and vendor risk events can have a dramatic impact on organization. So we're living in a world today where just for the boards, just to have like some type of like red, yellow, green dashboarding of the cyber situation, I don't think it's good enough anymore, right? They need to have that clear quantitative interpretation of what exactly the risk is and what are the financial and operational exposures and how that is being mitigated, right? So like anything, I think it's more of the quality of the information, not just the quantity of information, right? And so I think for them, real-time data, quantitative benchmarking of risks with this, high risk vendors and situations should be, elevated very easily, right, to the leadership. And then organizations can then use that framework as a forcing function to align, proper investments, proper remediation activities, and the alignment of the right priorities and teams to address those weak spots. And I think that will create an environment, especially for boards and for the leadership team, where things are being managed more proactively instead of firefighting, right? And some of it is just the reality of cybersecurity. It always feels like we're trying to react to something to happen and put out fires, spending time doing postmortems to understand why it happened. And then we run out of time to look at the future and see, okay, well, what's the up and coming risks that we should be proactively trying to manage for, right? So having these kind of like more real-time dashboarding, quantitative benchmarking activities should help improve the organization so they can be more forward-looking versus regressive. So yeah.
So Alex, like, do you think that currently the industry, like, they are realizing what are the challenges that is coming across because of the vendor risk?
I think they are, but I think like most in the industry, I think they're just overwhelmed with just so many projects and priorities, and so they know with each passing quarter, as the organization grows its business, as more new technologies, and now especially with AI coming on board, I mean, talk about additional multiplier of third-party touch points. But it's becoming a problem that I think is just, how do you keep up with that demand, right? And so I think they're aware, but I don't think there's a clear path today on how exactly to achieve that.
Right. Now, coming to this point that when we spoke about the quantified
Mhm.
risk, right? So looking ahead, how do you think or why that the quantifiable vendor intelligence, like it will become non-negotiable for the enterprises?
Yeah. I think with anything like continued rollout of regulation in this area will further accelerate adoption of more sophisticated techniques to meet the compliance. And so the analogy I give is just like if you look at things like GDPR, when GDPR was rolled out, it forced a lot of organizations to standardize and modernize their privacy and data protection operations. The same rollout of regulation in this area will force organizations to really sort of update their methodologies around cybersecurity, cyber risk, and vendor risk, and so forth, right? And so you've seen things like SEC reporting changes right now. Any major cybersecurity incident needs to be reported within four business days. There's subsequent 8K filings that need to be done, right? You see over in the EU, there's the DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act that was put out, and those define things that customers need to meet. And so as a result of that, having some quantifiable intelligence around your vendors is sort of a table stakes item in order to meet some of these regulations for any organization. And it's not like a nice to have thing anymore. And I think for CISOs to prepare for this shift, I think they should focus on maybe a few things, right? A lot of things they should be doing, but I think definitely getting deeper visibility into the vendor ecosystem, and so kind of get away from the sort of linear mapping of your vendors and more of an architectural topology view of that third-party vendor web that I'm describing. Second is probably shift towards more sort of outcome-based oversight of the issue. So it's once again moving away from just static checklists, being able to have a system and methodology where you're able to easily identify the situation, drill down, and set the corrective action. Quantifying the cyber risk. I mean, I think we talked about this, how this kind of removes some of the ambiguity around the severity of issue, helps create priority, creates understanding within the organization. And then, the last is probably, relying less on sort of manual vendor surveys and moving more to this kind of like a continuous telemetry type of view, right? And I think this is where, if I can plug, maybe do a little commercial for Zeron here is, I think this is where, if you look at our Zeron Cyber Navigator platform, it's an interesting solution that potentially can address a lot of these needs, right? So you have our Vendor Pulse, which is our third-party risk management software platform that gives you that real-time vendor intelligence, vendor scoring. And then if you combine that with things like our conformity product, which is our modules around compliance or regulation, you can kind of map that risk posture understanding for compliance along with things like financial risk scoring and everything. And together, you put those two together, you have a pretty interesting platform that can sort of give you more real-time visibility and more understanding of your overall risk posture. So, yeah.
Absolutely, Alex, I agree. So we are also having few questions again in the
Okay.
comment section. So we will just shoot it here.
Okay.
Looking ahead, what capabilities will organizations need to navigate vendor ecosystems more confidently in 2026 and beyond? I think, Alex, you already pointed like few of the things. You highlighted those, like what will the organizations need to deal with vendor risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if you can just again like highlight few of the things.
Yeah. I think maybe reiterate the last points I made. I mean, definitely having this sort of topology mapping of the vendor ecosystem, understanding the interactions of the different vendors, not just from a laundry list perspective, I think will give understanding to better find vulnerabilities and weak points proactively in your system, right? And then I think moving away from sort of static, periodic vendor assessments to something more of a kind of a continuous telemetry, and having a platform that can help ingest that information and process that will help provide that underlying framework for that. And I think being able to scale the operations, and so that's where having a way to sort of quantitatively benchmark not just the vendors but benchmark the risks and then the underlying results and impact to organization. That will help align resources and priorities, because kind of getting back to the topic we were talking about of how organizations are still playing catch up. If you're playing catch up, that means you can only do 8 things and there's a list of 50 things. And so the 8 or 10 things that you can do, you want to obviously make sure those are focused on the high impact things. And so as it relates to vendor risk, you obviously want to spend those scarce resources addressing the major issues. And so having a platform and a methodology that can help do that, I think will be very useful for CISOs and all teams involved within the organization.
Absolutely. I think it's time that people, they are being reactive, but it is high time
Mm-hmm.
that we have to be proactive in vendor risk as well. So
Yes.
there are just few things that we can get started with, and I think those will be the big steps at least to get started with.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you everyone who joined us today for this like insightful session. And I think you really got some insights from Alex as well. Vendor ecosystems will only grow more complex, and the clarity we bring to understanding their impact will define how confidently we navigate the future. So, saying that, we appreciate your time, and also you can explore Vendor Pulse, because that is how we are also focusing on how we can help the enterprises and organizations to deal with third party risk. So, be proactive in your risk mitigation, and also just stay tuned. We will be hosting more conversations like this to keep you aligned with what's the trends and also like what is evolving. Follow us on our socials to stay updated. Thank you so much for this session, Alex, and also for everyone to joining us.
Thank you. Awesome.